Sam Vaknin explains that there are two types of narcissism: healthy narcissism, or primary narcissism, and pathological narcissism, or secondary narcissism. Healthy narcissism is the natural self-esteem and self-confidence that allows individuals, especially children, to explore the world and develop a sense of self-worth. Pathological narcissism, on the other hand, arises from childhood abuse and trauma, leading some individuals to develop narcissistic traits as a coping mechanism. Childhood abuse and trauma can force children to find ways to avoid the pain, and this can lead to different outcomes. Outcome number 1, identifying with the abuser, becoming codependents. Outcome number 2, becoming the abuser themselves, turning into narcissists. And outcome number 3, attempting to become the abuser, but failing, leading to borderline personality traits. It's important to note that only a small percentage of children exposed to abuse and trauma develop these pathologies, while most become relatively healthy adults with some emotional challenges. Abuse is not limited to physical or verbal abuse. It can also include spoiling, pampering, idolizing, and using the child as a means of gratification. The common thread in all forms of abuse is the prevention of the child from developing their own identity and boundaries. In the case of pathological narcissism, the child creates a false self as a coping mechanism. This false self is a perfect, godlike figure that contrasts with the child's own feelings of helplessness and vulnerability. The child may even develop a private religion, worshiping and sacrificing to this invented god. As adults, individuals with pathological narcissism are in a post-traumatic state, and they often exhibit arrested development, getting stuck at a certain mental age, usually around 4 to 6 years old. Therapy for narcissists can be challenging because they need to be treated as the age they are mentally, not as adults. Additionally, understanding that narcissism is a post-traumatic condition rather than a personality disorder can guide treatment approaches. In summary, Sam Vaknin's explanation emphasizes the origins of pathological narcissism and childhood trauma, and the importance of recognizing it as a post-traumatic condition rather than a personality disorder. Understanding this perspective can inform more effective therapeutic approaches.
First of all, it's important to realize that everyone is a narcissist in the sense that everyone has something called healthy narcissism. It's also called primary narcissism. This is the kind of narcissism that babies have. This is the kind of narcissism that allows you as a child to venture out into the world and explore it, because it takes some grandiosity to assume that you as a baby can take on the world. So this is the kind of narcissism that underlies a well-regulated, internally regulated sense of self-worth, and self-esteem, and self-confidence. This is the kind of narcissism that allows you to ignore certain challenges and certain threats and just venture out there and do your thing. This is the kind of narcissism that allows you to stand up to bullies and enemies, etc., etc. So this is healthy narcissism. Everyone has it. Mm-hmm. Every single person on earth has it. Then there is the pathological kind, also known as secondary narcissism. The pathological kind is when there's a confluence of circumstances. The first and most important is trauma, childhood abuse and trauma. When the child is abused and traumatized, it does something to the child's mind. And that something is reversible because the brain is neuroplastic. It can be reprogrammed and deprogrammed via, for example, therapy, or even via self-work or self-analysis. So there is hope, but still it does something to the mind. And children then are forced, having been subjected to trauma and abuse, they are forced to find a solution somehow to avoid the pain and the hurt of being traumatized and abused. So one solution is to identify with the abuser, and they become codependents. Another solution is to become the abuser, to abuse, and then they become narcissists. And another solution is to try to become the abuser and to fail, and then they become borderlines. This is the etiology. These are the paths, psychodynamic, psychological development paths that lead to these pathologies. It's very important to emphasize that only a tiny percentage of children exposed to abuse and trauma develop these pathologies. The vast majority go on to be relatively healthy adults, albeit with problems some problems with depression and anxiety and so on. It's also equally important to explain or to expound on the term abuse, or on the concept of trauma. Abuse is not only when you beat up your child, is not only when you have incest with your child, is not only when you verbally and psychologically torment and taunt your child, or you humiliate your child. These are classic forms of abuse, and actually they are the minority. There are other forms of abuse which we tend to overlook or reframe or not treat as abuse or even condone. For example, when you spoil your child, when you pamper your child, when you idolize your child, when you place your child on a pedestal or the pedestal on your child, when you treat your child as an instrument of gratification, as the tool which will help you as a parent realize your fantasies and wishes, when you parentify your child, when you force your child to act as a parent to you, all these are forms of abuse. So the only thing that's common to all forms of abuse, classic and those that I've just mentioned, the only thing that's common to all of them is that the child is not allowed to separate from the parent. Child is not allowed to separate and to become an individual because the child is not allowed to develop boundaries and to set boundaries, to insist, to enforce them. The parent insists to invade the child, to assimilate the child, to treat the child as an extension, to merge and fuse with the child in a variety of ways. Socially acceptable ways like spoiling or pampering or idolizing, and socially unacceptable ways like incest. But there's absolutely no psychodynamic difference between incest and idolizing. None.
Wow.
In both these cases, the child becomes part of the parent, is not allowed to separate from the parent. In the second case of incest, it's physically, bodily, and in the case of pampering or spoiling or idolizing or using the child as instrument of gratification, it's psychologically. But in both cases, the child is not his or her own person. No personality is allowed to develop. So one of the solutions that children choose when they're exposed to these implicit or explicit messages, don't leave me, you are part of me, you will never be your own person. When they're faced with this kind of messaging, one of the solutions is known as pathological narcissism. And what the child does in pathological narcissism, he invents an imaginary friend called the false self. And this imaginary friend is everything the child is not. The child is helpless. This imaginary friend is omnipotent. The child cannot predict the behavior of the parents. The parents is unpredictable, capricious, arbitrary. The false self is omniscient, knows everything. The child is helpless, cannot cope with the abuse and the trauma, has no effective means and tools of managing the abuse and trauma, let alone eliminating it. The false self is all-powerful. So if you put all these attributes together, perfection, brilliance, omnipotence, omniscience, if you put all these together, you get the attributes of God. So the false self is a God. What happens to a child who is exposed to trauma and abuse, when and if he chooses the narcissistic solution, is that the child develops a private religion. He invents a God, and then he worships this God, and then he sacrifices to this God. He makes a human sacrifice. He sacrifices himself because it's the only human he has access to. So he makes a human sacrifice. It's a recreation of primitive proto-religions. Absolutely. It's like exactly what Jung said. Jung called it the collective unconscious.
Right.
It's like we are like the child recreates the history of the race, the history of the species, in his attitude, in his attempts to cope. So when the child grows up, there are essentially two serious problems. One, the child, when he becomes an adult, the child is in a post-traumatic state. Narcissism is a post-traumatic condition, not in my view at least. I'm trying to reconceive of it as a post-traumatic condition, not a personality disorder.
Interesting.
So,
Okay.
So it's a post-traumatic condition. And the second problem, arrested development. The child never becomes an adult, at least not mentally. he gets stuck at some stage of development, usually 6 years old. It's 6 to 9. 9 is a very, very well-developed, mentally well-developed narcissist. Most narcissists are 4 to 6 years old. And here's the problem, and here's why we keep failing in therapy when we are trying to treat narcissists. We keep failing in therapy because we relate to narcissists. We try to negotiate with narcissists. We try to talk reason. We try to rationalize. We treat the narcissist that comes into the clinic, into the office. We treat the narcissist as an adult. But the narcissist is not an adult. It's a 4-year-old. It's a 6-year-old. And of course, all adult therapies fail with narcissists.
Right.
Because they're not adults. That's first thing. The second thing, we treat narcissism as an all-pervasive problem of the personality, as a multidimensional, cancerous process, which affects every dimension of personality and every dimension of functioning. Consequently, we roll out systemic solutions. We try to cope with the problem systemically. It's a little like treating common cold as though it were cancer. But narcissism is a post-traumatic condition. We do know that trauma does affect all dimensions of functionality, including, for example, interpersonal relationships, and all cognitive dimensions, and all emotional dimensions. We know this. But we equally know that trauma is totally reversible, and that it can be cured and healed, totally.
Oh.